John Riggi has spent nearly 30 years as a highly decorated veteran of the FBI, and now serves as Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk for the American Hospital Association and its more than 5,000 member hospitals. In his role, he serves as a national resource to assist members in defending against cyber attacks and other threats to their organizations. Welcome to Advancing Health, a podcast brought to you by the American Hospital Association. I'm Tom Hedderly with AHA Communications. In this podcast, we have a unique opportunity to talk to two leading experts in the field of cybersecurity, who are also John's close friends and colleagues. Section Chief David Ring is with the FBI's Cyber Engagement and Intelligence Section, and Errol Weiss is the Chief Security Officer at H-ISAC. David and Errol will discuss the latest ransomware attacks on hospitals, as well as the partnership between H-ISAC, AHA, and the FBI to exchange cyber threat intel and to broadcast and amplify warnings. Now here's John.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. This is John Riggi, your Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk. Thanks again for joining us for another episode in our continuing Cyber and Risk podcast series, Frontline Perspective. In this series, we feature highly accomplished leaders from the healthcare field, cybersecurity industry, and government. They provide us the inside story and their frontline perspective on cyber and national security threats to healthcare and best practices to help identify and reduce the risks posed by those threats. Today, we will not only be discussing the value of cyber threat information sharing within the healthcare sector and between healthcare and the government, for the common and greater good of cyber defense of the nation, this podcast will also serve as an example of that sharing in action by the nature of our guests today and who they represent. So I'm pleased and privileged to have two friends and colleagues from private sector and government here with me today to discuss cyber threat information sharing, which I think is very appropriate in this National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. First, we have David Ring. Dave is the Section Chief of FBI's Cyber Engagement and Intelligence Section, where he leads the FBI Cyber Division's private sector engagement and cyber criminal intelligence missions. Dave began his career in the FBI in 2004 as an intelligence analyst and has served in a variety of intelligence and leadership roles in the Counterterrorism Division, where he played a critical role on the intelligence aspect of high-profile terrorist attack investigations, such as the Boston Marathon bombing. Also here with me today is my good friend and colleague, Errol Weiss. Errol Weiss first joined the Health Information Sharing and Analysis Center in 2019 as its first Chief Security Officer and created a Threat Intelligence Analysis Center that provides members with meaningful and actionable threat intelligence relevant for information technology and information security professionals in the healthcare sector. Errol has over 25 years of experience in information security, beginning his career with the National Security Agency and in financial services at Citigroup and Bank of America, where I first met Errol. So Errol, let's start with you. Can you briefly describe to us what the mission of the H-ISAC is? Errol, can you also tell us how you collect that information in both a manual peer-to-peer mode and automated methods?
Hey, thanks, John. It's great to be here with you, and pleased to be a partner with the American Hospital Association as well. And so, it's great to be working with you here on this. So, in terms of background, H-ISAC is a global nonprofit organization. We are a member-driven, member-owned organization that provides healthcare companies a trusted community for coordinating, collaborating, and sharing not only cyber threat intelligence, but physical security issues as well, and best practices with each other. In terms of the tooling, we provide everything from the technology and the people behind the scenes to help with that collaboration and cooperation across the sector. The Threat Operations Center that you mentioned earlier is staffed with full-time analysts in Titusville, Florida, and we help provide that collaboration and help foster some of the information sharing between our members across the sector. And to your point, there's a bit of manual information sharing that's happening today, but we've also built a very robust automated indicator sharing system as well. So as threat indicators of compromise are shared with us, or we gather them from other sources, we're able to push those out automatically to our members for their use within their own networks. And we're sharing thousands of indicators on average a month with our members.
Thanks, Errol. So with all that sharing that's going on amongst the sector and between the sector and H-ISAC, I'm sure you hear this question quite often. How is the confidentiality of that information sharing protected?
Yeah, it's always a great question. So our members are actually bound by a confidentiality agreement that they sign when they become members with us. And essentially they are bound to adhere to an information classification system that we call the traffic light protocol, or you're also here called TLP. And it uses the various colors of everyday traffic lights to establish those information classification levels. So the originators who source the information with us and with the network of their colleagues, they're able to easily mark that data when they share it with us as being either public and openly available, or on the other extreme, something that's very sensitive and maybe only shareable to members without attribution.
Thanks, Errol. Obviously, it seems to work very well. So you're protecting not only the content of the information, but the source of that information. Dave, let me turn to you. Although I'm very familiar with your role and function of the cyber outreach section, because that was my last position in the FBI, and as a current consumer of your information. But for our audience, can you describe the mission of cyber outreach and how you share information, not only across the sector in peer-to-peer format, but also in an automated fashion?
Hi, John. Thanks very much. And first, let me just say how much I appreciate the opportunity to sit here with you and Errol to talk through what is an extraordinarily important subject, and one that, of course, is near and dear to both of our hearts, having shared this same job. And so our mission here in cyber outreach, and how we're phrasing it now, is cyber private sector engagement, because it's more than just reaching out. It's continued engagement focused around substantive issues, where sharing critical information that oftentimes, and more often than not, when it comes to cybersecurity and threat intelligence and indicators of compromise, IOCs, are collected by the private sector. What is our role as the FBI in that process? And so I would say that our role is twofold. It is both I'll use old CT terms, left of boom, meaning pre-incident, and right of boom, post-incident. But it really actually starts in many cases right of boom, post-incident, where as we respond as the lead investigative agency on cyber threats to the United States and U.S. businesses, will respond to an incident, and through open sharing and trusted sharing with victims, we'll collect information that's very relevant, not just to our investigations, but also to potential future victims of similar incidents and attacks. And so we take that information, oftentimes we'll enrich it with FBI data from our investigations and our intelligence gathering efforts, and then share that back through and across industry, of course, in an anonymized and appropriate fashion, similar to what Errol pointed out that the H-ISAC does, is getting that critical cyber threat information, those IOCs and TTPs of these organizations, out to as many potential future victims as possible to prevent that future victimization. And how do we do that, both peer-to-peer and automated? We share what we call private industry notifications, which will generally share TTPs and other threat information, and then flash reports, which will share that technical information that net defenders can use through a variety of means, through our Internet Crime Complaint Center at ic3.gov, directly outward to a number of our partners through CyWatch, our 24-hour ops center, and then directly with our trusted partners from my section. And that's more that peer-to-peer approach, which would then work with you all to further disseminate that.
Thanks, Dave. A couple of points that you brought up I thought were very interesting. First, let me say I do like the name Cyber Engagement Section, certainly better than Cyber Outreach. I think that really does capture the mission. And the fact that you focus on getting the information out quickly to warn the sector, as we did in counterterrorism when you and I were both there. The primary objective is to prevent harm, to prevent harm to the public. It is not just simply gathering threat intelligence to further investigations. And the other mission I think that cyber engagement does very well is that combination of classified intelligence, public information, and information provided by Errol. You all distill that down, declassify what you can, and then push it out as meaningful intelligence products. So I applaud you guys for continuing that mission over there in cyber engagement. And I think it's been very valuable to prevent further attacks, especially right now we're seem to be under siege with ransomware attacks. Speaking of ransomware attacks, Errol, let me turn to you. In this age of heightened ransomware attacks against hospitals and healthcare in general, why is it so important for the healthcare sector to share cyber threat information? And what should be shared? What is the value for the sector?
Yeah, actually, during my days in the banking sector, I saw firsthand the benefits of information sharing when I ran threat intelligence at Citibank and also during my time at Bank of America. And I was on the front lines sharing with my peers then, and during some pretty tough times, especially when the banking sector was being targeted by the Iranians during the DDoS attacks that were happening way back in 2012 and 13 at this time. So from the sector perspective, and really, building on top of what Dave was saying with respect to the FBI pins and flash reports, I know when we see those and we reshare those with our members, we're re-emphasizing what's in those reports and basically telling our members, you need to pay attention to these because there's some victim behind those reports. There's a reason why FBI is sharing that, and you need to pay attention to the indicators and other information that's contained in those reports. And building on that, the whole idea about, from the sector perspective, about sharing that incident information, getting the members within H-ISAC to share incident information or the technical indicators that they see on these attacks, it leads to this improved security posture for the other members with this shared situational awareness down to the organizational level. And I liken it to essentially the links in the chain, if you will, where companies can take advantage of that shared learning and one, make sure that their own systems are not vulnerable to what they're learning about from the peer organizations, and two, that they're able to look for even prior exposures within their own environments. So you can protect yourself from the learnings and the experiences that's being shared by others, or even the pins and flashes that I mentioned earlier. On top of that, the thing that I like about the information sharing network, and just looking inward, just in the H-ISAC example itself, I shared something last night. There were over 5,000 people on the mailing list and the sharing list that I put something out to with H-ISAC. So there's a lot of people out there that can look at the information, provide some feedback, provide some additional information, additional insight from their own perspectives, and we all learn essentially from the greater good. And I think with that, with that broader knowledge of the attacks, we can even potentially work with law enforcement to build a potentially bigger case by learning about the attacks that may be happening, similar attacks that may be happening at other organizations. And then finally, on the personal level, I know that I learned so much by participating in the sharing network, learning from others, emulating the behaviors that I saw. It led to my own professional development and my own career growth, and it was just a phenomenal experience for me personally.
Thanks, Errol. Clearly, some collateral benefits there. Again, both on the personal, but more on the threat protection side for the entire sector. And I see your alerts constantly, and we do post them on our website at aha.org/cybersecurity. Errol, one follow-up with you there. So you explained how you share information across the sector, but also, so how do you share that information back with the government? Clearly, private sector as a whole probably has access to more intelligence and information regarding cyber threats than the government at times.
Yeah, the good news is that we've got a lot of great ways to get the information to our various government partners. And so everything from the point where a member wants to share something with H-ISAC, one of the options they have there is to select who outside H-ISAC they might want to share something with. So they can select government, law enforcement, DHS, and others, for example, that they want us to purposefully push that information to as well. And we've got the built-in channels today on how to do that, taking advantage of the tools and systems that exist today to securely do that. And we do that fairly regularly.
Thanks, Errol. Dave, just switching facets here just a bit on cyber threat intelligence sharing. I'm encouraged to see what appears to be these timely joint interagency intelligence products being produced. As you know, I love to see the multiple seals from the different agencies across the top of those products. How are your private sector threat intelligence products, such as the flashes and pins you discussed, how are they informed by government and by the healthcare sector?
Sure. Thanks, John. So first, I'll point out, in addition to the pins and flashes, which we've talked about here, a relatively about a year-old product line effort joint with the interagency is the Cybersecurity Advisory. So you'll see CSAs as well. Those are always going to be a multi-agency product. So oftentimes it's the FBI and CISA, but there are other sometimes sector risk management agencies that join on and other government agencies that join those. And in some cases, even H-ISACs can join on so that there's even greater joint messaging. One thing I'd say related to those is not that they're of more value or more critical than the individual sealed warnings and advisories that go out, but oftentimes if you see a significant number of agencies all jumping onto one piece of threat information or threat intelligence that needs to be shared, it's worth paying extra attention to. And so I'll use the Labor Day CSA that went out just in advance of this past Labor Day weekend. And the reason that we pushed that out, it really was to make sure everybody in private sector was paying attention to the fact that the previous 3 holiday weekends, we saw major attacks on critical infrastructure from ransomware actors, to include the Kaseya attack, the Colonial Pipeline attack, and others. It's extra important to be aware of what's out there and not just what the FBI is pushing out, but what CISA is reporting. And when we come together to report those jointly, it's worth paying attention to. How those products are informed across government and by the healthcare sector, really, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that proactive sharing. So we're always trying to gather as much information as we possibly can on threats that affect any entity within the United States. That's the job of the FBI. But just holding that information and not sharing it, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, really ends up potentially putting lots of others at risk. So the FBI always has to make a risk calculus decision on what we share, why, and when. And what we've shifted toward much more significantly since we rolled out our new cyber strategy about a little over a year ago, is being more proactive in our sharing and shifting our calculus towards more proactive sharing, potentially putting additional, not risk, but additional pressure on our investigations. And what I mean by that is it's the FBI's reaction most of the time to preserve those investigations and the sensitivity of those investigations to ensure that they end up with a positive outcome, previously at the expense, in some cases, of sharing. So what we've shifted is saying, okay, we're willing to take a little bit more of a risk in our investigation to make sure that we share this information out proactively, because the benefit of sharing and potentially protecting thousands of future victims is more toward the end of our mission set than simply running that investigation. And so we're making those changes for the very purpose of ensuring that private sector knows that we really truly mean it when we say we need to share to counter this threat. However, our investigations also are what gives us the information that we can use to provide that very significant threat intelligence and those advisories out. So both are critical to our efforts, but we've recognized the need to ensure prevention oftentimes over response.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Having lived that, what I call the tension, the push-pull between advising, warning the public, and preserving the investigations, which ultimately would also help protect the public from harm. Constant, I think, weighing of priorities, but glad to see that the emphasis is based on preventing harm, as it was in counterterrorism days. So I have to ask a follow-up on this. Again, you probably get this question a lot, but all that cyber threat intelligence that you're gathering, often from victims, directly dealing with victims, and where you get an inside look at how the breach occurred, what were the vulnerabilities, what potentially were the failings that led to that breach. Do you ever pass that information to regulatory agencies for them to initiate investigations or audits of the victims of the attacks?
So I'd encourage anyone who's been reticent about working directly with the FBI for one reason or another, especially following a potential attack, to take a look at our cyber strategy. In that strategy, and that's available at FBI.gov, in that strategy is a pledge to victims. And our pledge is that our goal and our mission at the FBI is to identify the actors and the individuals behind these attacks to prevent future attacks and to bring justice to the victim, be it a small rural hospital or a massive hospital system in a major city. We approach those victims in the same way from the perspective of we're here to gather that information that we can use as evidence to forward our investigation. Of course, when appropriate and in consultation with the victim, we'll share that information to prevent future attacks in an anonymized fashion, that critical threat information across private sector to prevent future attacks. However, what the FBI is not is a regulatory agency. So we don't come into a victim's systems and start looking for things to provide back to anybody outside of what the goal in terms of forwarding that mission. Our goal is collecting evidence and bringing justice to the victim. Again, as I said, we're not a regulatory agency. We don't show up and start talking to the company about whether or not they should pay a ransom or how they should handle the attack internally within their organization. But what I will say is, when we talk about government response to cyber attacks, there are multiple agencies that respond, and there are multiple agencies that have a role, from the sector risk management agencies such as Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services, and organizations like CISA. When it comes to incident response and assisting victims, our goal is the same. So a call to one is a call to all. If you call us, we will talk to CISA, we will talk to the sector risk management agency to ensure that we're all working to prevent future attacks and mitigate the attack that happened on that victim. But again, I'll reiterate that the FBI is not a regulatory organization or agency.
Thanks, Dave. Encouraging. So in sum, investigators, not regulators, and you'll work with all the partners across the interagency. CISA, by the way, for folks who aren't aware, maybe listening, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under DHS. Errol, so we've talked about the mission of the H-ISAC and how you share cyber threat information, but we would be remiss if we don't use this opportunity to talk about the current threats. Can you tell us about the latest cyber threats that you're seeing out there and how it's impacting healthcare, what the trends might be?
Yeah, John, I wish I had good news for network defenders, but it seems it's just constantly getting worse. So, from what we're hearing from our members over the past month, the pandemic is a tough time for IT teams and network defenders for lots of reasons, largely because we have a remote workforce. We are still seeing threat actors intercepting remote work credentials. So from people logging in from their home offices to their work environment, still continuing to steal those credentials. We're seeing those being used to essentially gain access to Office VPNs. And then likewise, still seeing continued use of credentials in other attacks. So, humans will often use the same username and passwords to log into multiple sites online. So bad guys will steal credentials from one site and potentially replay them elsewhere in the hopes that they get in. And we know that that works from human behavior. And we are seeing those kinds of attacks still being used to perpetrate fraud and other online account takeovers. There's a host of malware that our member organizations are still seeing. For the past month, the big ones are things like SolarMarker, Griffin, and Sockulush. Those continue to plague members. And then finally, we're seeing threat actors actually attempt to recruit insiders. I would say mostly disgruntled employees or people that are looking to leave their current position. We're seeing threat actors attempting to recruit those insiders and planting malware on the inside networks, and reports of that as well. So again, unfortunately, our network defenders and our security staff have got an ever challenging and ever increasing threat landscape to deal with here.
Well, I'd like to say thanks for the news, but as I appreciate your input anyways. And of course, we're all aware, right? The threat is constantly evolving. And no matter what we do, we can't eliminate the threat. We're just trying to mitigate. Dave, same question for you. Can you tell us about the latest cyber threats, what you're seeing out there impacting healthcare specifically, and what the trends might be?
Sure. So, from the FBI's perspective, the greatest and most visible threat to all U.S. critical infrastructure, but particularly the healthcare sector, is ransomware, right? And it will continue to be ransomware, I will say, for the foreseeable future, simply because it pays off, right? The actors behind these ransomware variants that are out there deploying it on your member systems are getting paid, and they're making their money, and it's a successful business model. And so, what I'll talk about a little bit is how we've seen that business model evolve over the past 1 to 2 years, where previously ransomware attacks would essentially, through how Errol described, different methods of entering your organization's systems, they would deploy a malware that would essentially lock down that system and hold it hostage until a ransom was paid. So, what we've seen become the most popular model over the past couple of years now is what we call a double extortion model, where they'll both deploy that malware, lock down the system, but then also exfiltrate sensitive data from the system and threaten to leak that data openly online if a ransom was not paid, therefore giving the organization even more incentive to pay, even if they had viable backups. What we're now seeing emerge is a what we call triple extortion model, where it includes locking down the system, exfiltrating data, threatening to leak it, and in some cases, instituting essentially a DDoS attack with a barrage on the system to prevent the outward facing websites and other systems from working within that organization to make payment even more of a critical consideration for the victim. And so that's how the ransomware model has evolved. And along with that evolution has come continuously record making ransoms that have been requested and paid to, going from the hundreds to the thousands, now into the hundreds of thousands, and in many, many cases, millions of dollars that victims are being forced to pay to release their systems. So not only is it becoming a more disruptive and frequent issue, it's also becoming much more costly.
Dave, thanks for the latest update. Again, clearly not the news we want to hear, but we have to continue to be vigilant and continue to share information as we've been discussing. So let's wrap up here as we get down to the wire here on our podcast. Errol, any final thoughts that you could give us briefly?
Yeah, John, I know I would encourage our listeners here. I know it's hard to share in the midst of an incident or a crisis, but it is possible to do it, especially as Dave mentioned, even if you're working with law enforcement. So I encourage you to do it for the greater good, as we've talked about here today during this podcast. One other thing, just a takeaway I'll offer up here is that H-ISAC published a white paper on information sharing best practices. I know that many of us, and myself included, often struggle with how to get started with information sharing, even knowing what to share, but then often also dealing with internal approvals in your management, maybe even general counsel, often needing the appropriate approvals from your management and general counsel on what to share externally. So the white paper is available on the H-ISAC website. It's h-isac.org. You can look under the resources and white papers tab. That was published in March of 2020, or you can do a Google search for H-ISAC info sharing best practices, and you'll find that paper there. Again, I really want to thank Dave here. I learned a few things myself. It's great to partner here with FBI, and John, always appreciate the partnership with AHA as well.
Thanks, Errol. Dave, any final thoughts you can give us in this last minute?
Sure. I'll repeat, I think, what folks who are paying attention when it comes to cybersecurity have heard over and over again. Secure your systems, patch your systems, train your employees, because every employee is a potential open door into your systems, and ensure that you've got viable backups, because there's no better way to recover from a ransomware attack than prevention in the first place, but of course having those viable backups to recover. The very last thing I would say is, if you take away nothing else, please reach out to your local FBI field office proactively before anything bad happens. Our greatest asset at the FBI is the fact that within an hour or less, we can have an FBI agent on the doorstep of any organization across the country. We have 56 field offices and hundreds of sub offices across the United States. And having that proactive outreach and that contact that you can just pick up the phone and just call anybody that you know in that FBI field office when something bad happens gets the ball rolling infinitely quicker than a cold call after an attack. That said, if you are hit and you don't have that proactively obtained point of contact for the FBI, please reach out to us via CyWatch at FBI.gov or through IC3.gov. That's the Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3.gov. You can report any type of cyber incident on that website. The last thing I'd say is IC3.gov is also a phenomenal resource to go through and look at previously published pins and flashes and other products. And included on those at the very end are going to be recommendations on how to secure your systems. I'd ask everybody to go take a look at those and see what you haven't done in your organization to try to employ to protect yourselves better. Thanks very much, John, for having me on and giving us the opportunity to talk. And thanks, Errol, very much for your partnership at the H-ISAC in the past and, of course, moving forward.
Thank you both, Dave and Errol, as we continue here together in our fight in this against cyber threats, really in this whole of nation approach. And I want to thank you both individually also for all that you do in your organizations to keep the nation safe. And thanks to all our healthcare listeners for what you do and have done during the pandemic to care for our patients and keep our communities safe. This has been John Riggi, your Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk. Stay safe, everyone.